How far would a mother go to save her own son from the executioner's block? Would she rewrite the ancient laws of an empire? And if she took the axe into her own hands, what kind of monster would she become? Welcome to the darkest century of the Ottoman Empire, a realm of absolute power and unbearable cruelty. She was ripped from the freezing mountains of the Caucasus and thrown into the deadliest royal court on earth. But she refused to be a pawn on this bloody chessboard. Instead, she became the ultimate puppet master. In an era of strangled princes and mad kings, this is the chilling true story of Halime Sultan. History is usually written by the men who sit on the throne, the emperors who swing the swords and command the armies. But during the most turbulent, blood-soaked era of the Ottoman Empire, the course of history wasn't altered by generals or politicians. It was altered by women. Women who built empires with whispers behind the thick, impenetrable walls of the imperial harem. And among these women, no story is more ruthless, more tragic, and more terrifying than that of Halime Sultan. To understand the monster she became, you have to understand the nightmare she was born into. It was the early 1570s. In the rugged, unforgiving and freezing mountains of Abkhazia, near the Black Sea, a young girl was living a life of relative freedom. But the brutal realities of the 16th century were waiting to swallow that freedom whole. Abkhazia was a prime hunting ground for slave traders. Villages were routinely raided, families torn apart, and children stolen in the dead of night. Halime was one of those children. Captured by ruthless slavers, she was stripped of her name, her family, and her past. She was thrown into the dark, suffocating hull of an Ottoman slave ship bound for the capital. Imagine the sheer terror, a young girl chained in the pitch-black belly of a wooden ship, crashing through the violent waves of the Black Sea, surrounded by the weeping of hundreds of other stolen children. She had absolutely no idea that this terrifying journey would eventually place her at the absolute pinnacle of the world's most powerful empire. When the ship finally docked in Istanbul, the capital of the world, she was thrust into the chaotic and ruthless slave markets. Surrounded by wealthy merchants and palace officials, her striking beauty, fierce eyes, and unbroken demeanor caught the immediate attention of the royal buyers. She wasn't destined to be a common house servant. She was purchased for the absolute highest echelons of power. She was thrown directly into the arms of the Ottoman dynasty, sent to the magnificent provincial palace of Manisa to serve Prince Mehmed, the man destined to become the future emperor of the world. But entering the imperial harem wasn't a fairy tale. The harem wasn't just a house for beautiful women, as Western myths and rumors often portray. It was an elite, highly disciplined, and absolutely cutthroat institution. It was a golden cage where girls from all over the known world, Russia, Greece, the Caucasus, the Balkans, were trained with the strictness of a military academy. They were taught literature, theology, music, and the complex etiquette of the royal court. They were being forged into fiercely loyal subjects of the state, weapons to be used by the dynasty. Halime quickly realized a terrifying truth. In this golden cage, there were only two options. You either fade into the shadows and die a forgotten servant, or you fight, manipulate, and rise to the absolute top. She chose to rise. She mastered the Turkish language with perfection, learned the intricate politics of the palace, and when the moment came, she captivated Prince Mehmed. But Halime was far too smart to rely on beauty alone. Beauty fades, but influence lasts. She didn't just become his favorite concubine, she became his intellectual equal, his confidant, his most trusted political advisor. This extreme intimacy gave her something absolutely priceless in the deadly world of the Ottoman court: leverage. By the year 1587, she achieved the ultimate goal of any woman in the harem. She gave birth to a male heir. She gave him his firstborn son, Prince Mahmud. The birth of a son instantly elevated her status from a mere slave to the mother of a royal prince. And she didn't stop there. She soon gave birth to a daughter, and later to another boy named Mustafa, a child who would grow up to suffer severe mental instability, locked in a dungeon, becoming one of the most tragic figures in human history. For Halime, these years in the provincial palace of Manisa were the golden years. She was the mother of the heir apparent, standing proudly beside the man she loved, practically ruling a small kingdom of her own. She had wealth, respect, and unparalleled power for a young woman of her age. But in the Ottoman Empire, happiness was a dangerous illusion. It always lived under the heavy, looming shadow of the executioner's blade. Halime knew that the current emperor, Murad III, was rapidly aging in Istanbul. Soon, her husband Mehmed would be called to the capital to take the throne. And when that happened, they would have to face the darkest, most terrifying law of the Ottoman dynasty, the law of fratricide. A law that demanded rivers of royal blood. The golden years were about to end, and a nightmare of unimaginable proportions was about to begin. The year was 1595. A brutal, freezing winter had descended upon the magnificent city of Istanbul. But the chill in the air was absolutely nothing compared to the ice that was about to grip the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Inside the heavily guarded, opulent walls of Topkapi Palace, Emperor Murad III took his final breath. The throne of the most powerful, sprawling empire on earth was now empty. Hundreds of miles away, in the provincial palace of Manisa, a secret messenger arrived in the dead of night, bearing the earth-shattering news. Halime's husband, Prince Mehmed, was now the emperor of the world. As they hastily packed their belongings to begin the dangerous journey to the capital, Halime's heart raced. She was no longer just a favored concubine. She was the mother of the new crown prince. She was walking straight into the epicenter of global power. But what she didn't realize was that she was also walking straight into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. You see, the Ottoman Empire had a terrifying, ironclad law written into its very constitution: the law of fratricide. To prevent bloody civil wars and secure the absolute stability of the state, a new sultan was legally required to execute all of his male brothers the moment he took the throne. It didn't matter if they were grown men who had plotted treason or innocent infants sleeping peacefully in their cribs. The law demanded blood. As Halime and the new emperor stepped through the colossal gates of Topkapi Palace, the horrifying reality of this law was unleashed. Following ancient tradition, 19 completely innocent royal princes, the brothers of her husband, were rounded up in the dead of night. 19 boys, some of them barely toddlers, were confronted by the Sultan's elite assassins, the deaf and mute executioners. The executioners used silken cords to strangle the boys, ensuring that sacred royal blood was never spilled on the ground. The sound of desperate weeping echoed through the cold stone courtyards of the harem. The screams of 19 grieving mothers pierced the absolute silence of the night. The next morning, as the new emperor ascended to the golden throne, 19 small wooden coffins were carried out of the palace gates in a massive, deeply traumatizing funeral procession. Halime stood there, watching those small, lifeless boxes pass by. The sheer horror of the massacre broke something deep inside her. As she clutched her own sons, Prince Mahmud and the young Prince Mustafa, she made a silent, unbreakable, and highly dangerous vow. She swore to the heavens that her children would never end up in those wooden boxes. She would burn the entire empire to the ground before she let the executioners touch her sons. But surviving in Topkapi Palace required more than just a mother's fierce determination. Standing between Halime and the survival of her children was an impenetrable wall of terrifying power. The Queen Mother, Safiye Sultan. Safiye was not just a mother, she was the undisputed, absolute ruler of the palace. She controlled the empire's immense wealth, directed foreign policy, corresponded with Queen Elizabeth of England, and completely overshadowed her own son, the new emperor. Safiye was a master of political manipulation, and she immediately recognized the burning ambition in Halime's fierce green eyes. She knew that Halime was not going to be a submissive, obedient daughter-in-law. Halime was a threat that had to be destroyed. To neutralize her, Safiye launched a ruthless psychological war. She constantly threw beautiful, exotic young concubines at the Sultan, trying to distract him and break his emotional bond with Halime. More devastatingly, the all-powerful Queen Mother used her supreme authority to block Halime from receiving the official royal title of Haseki, the chief consort. This wasn't just an insult, it was a devastating political strike. Without the title, Halime was legally stripped of the immense daily salary, the massive retinue of servants, and the formal political power that should have been hers. But Safiye severely underestimated her opponent. Halime didn't need an official title or a daily allowance to rule his mind. While Safiye controlled the grand ceremonies and the treasury, Halime operated in the shadows. Behind closed doors, in the total privacy of the royal bedchamber, she became the Sultan's only true sanctuary. When he was utterly exhausted by his mother's overbearing dominance and the crushing weight of the crown, it was Halime who whispered state policies into his ear. She slowly, methodically, began turning the emperor against his own mother. The chessboard was set, and the two most dangerous women in the world were now locked in a silent, deadly war for the soul of the Ottoman Empire. As the years passed behind the suffocating walls of Topkapi Palace, Halime's eldest son, Prince Mahmud, grew from a bright child into a fierce, intensely charismatic young warrior. He was everything his father, the emperor, was not. While Sultan Mehmed III preferred the quiet luxury of the palace and grew increasingly distant from the battlefield, Prince Mahmud possessed the blazing spirit of his ancestors. He was bold, athletic, and fiercely eager to lead the Ottoman armies into war. This warrior spirit quickly captured the absolute devotion of the Janissaries, the elite, heavily armed, and highly dangerous Praetorian Guard of the empire. Whenever the young prince rode through the streets of Istanbul, the crowds cheered and the soldiers struck their shields in respect. But in the dark, paranoid world of the Ottoman court, popularity was not a blessing. It was a terrifying curse. It was a death sentence. The aging emperor, plagued by failing health and crippling insecurity, began to look at his own son with deep suspicion. He didn't see a loyal heir. He saw a young, hungry wolf waiting to rip the crown from his head. And hovering constantly in the background, manipulating these dark fears, was the Queen Mother, Halime Sultan. Safiye hated Halime, and by extension, she despised Prince Mahmud. Safiye expertly and relentlessly fueled the emperor's paranoia. She whispered poisonous rumors into his ear, suggesting that Mahmud was secretly meeting with military commanders, plotting a violent coup to overthrow his own father. Halime was a master of political survival, and she could smell the impending danger. She knew that Safiye was tightening the noose around her son's neck. Desperate times make people take desperate, unpredictable actions. And in her overwhelming fear for her son's life, Halime made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. In the strict secrecy of the harem, she secretly wrote a letter to a famous religious mystic, a psychic known for his highly accurate prophecies. Her questions were born out of pure, desperate survival. When will the Sultan die? Will my son Mahmud safely take the throne? It was an incredibly dangerous gamble. In the 17th century, trying to predict the death of an emperor wasn't just a spiritual inquiry, it was considered the absolute highest form of treason. In 1603, the inevitable disaster struck. The Queen Mother's network of spies was vast, and the chief eunuch intercepted the encrypted letter before it could ever be destroyed. When the letter was brought to the Sultan and the prophecy detailing his own impending death was read aloud, he completely snapped. The paranoia that Safiye had spent years cultivating finally exploded into blinding rage. That very night, armed guards burst into Prince Mahmud's chambers. The young, beloved heir was violently dragged into the pitch-black dungeons beneath the palace. For 2 agonizing days, the prince was subjected to brutal interrogation and torture. Yet, despite the unimaginable pain, the brave young warrior completely refused to confess to treason. He swore he had never plotted against his father. Above ground, Halime Sultan was living a nightmare. She threw herself at the Sultan's feet, weeping uncontrollably, kissing the hem of his robe. She begged for her son's life. She promised that she and Mahmud would leave the capital forever, that they would live in total exile, far away from the throne. But the Sultan's mind, poisoned by his mother Safiye, was already made up. Blood had to be spilled to secure the crown. On the 3rd night, the heavy iron doors of the dungeon opened. The deaf and mute executioners stepped into the darkness, holding the traditional silken cord. Mahmud fought them with the ferocity of a lion, but he was outnumbered and weakened. The cord eventually found his neck, and the brightest hope of the Ottoman Empire was slowly strangled to death in the cold, unforgiving dark. Halime didn't just lose a beloved son that night. She lost the last remaining shred of her humanity. As a punishment, she was violently banished from Topkapi and sent to the Old Palace, a crumbling, isolated prison for discarded royal women. But as she walked out of those heavy iron gates, tears streaming down her face, a terrifying transformation occurred. The grieving, desperate mother died that night in the dungeon with her son. And in her place, a cold, ruthless, and highly dangerous political mastermind was born. The empire thought they had broken her. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. For 14 agonizing years, Halime Sultan was left to rot in the crumbling, decaying walls of the old palace. Stripped of her immense wealth, her royal titles, and her beloved eldest son, she was expected to quietly fade away into the dark pages of history. But grief is a powerful, dangerous fuel. While the rest of the empire assumed she was simply weeping in the shadows, Halime was meticulously plotting her revenge. She didn't just survive her exile, she weaponized it. She used the vast, hidden wealth she had smuggled out of Topkapi to build an incredible underground network. She bribed high-ranking eunuchs, cultivated spies within the palace guard, and forged a terrifying alliance with a brutal, fiercely ambitious military commander named Kara Davud Pasha, whom she strategically married off to her own daughter. Meanwhile, back in the glittering halls of Topkapi Palace, a monumental, earth-shattering shift had occurred. The horrific era of mass royal executions, the bloody law of fratricide, was finally abolished. But in its place, the Ottoman dynasty invented something arguably far crueler: a psychological torture device known as the kafes, or the cage. Instead of being strangled upon a new emperor's ascension, royal princes were now locked inside a heavily guarded, claustrophobic suite of rooms deep within the harem. There were no windows facing the outside world. There was no education, no political training, and absolutely no contact with the military or the public. The princes were essentially buried alive, waiting in total, paralyzing isolation to either take the throne one day or to be executed. Halime's only surviving son, Prince Mustafa, had been locked inside this golden cage since he was just a little boy. For years, he sat in the suffocating darkness, entirely alone. The absolute isolation, the constant, crushing paranoia that death executioners would walk through his door at any moment, and the deeply traumatizing memory of his older brother's brutal murder completely broke his mind. By the time he reached adulthood, Mustafa was no longer functioning. He was clinically, hopelessly insane. But in 1617, the wheel of fortune violently turned again. The ruling emperor suddenly died, and Halime, pulling strings from the shadows of her exile, orchestrated a political miracle that left the entire empire in shock. Using her extensive network of bribes and the looming military threat of Kara Davud Pasha, she successfully convinced the elite Ottoman court that her mentally shattered son, Mustafa, was the rightful, legitimate heir to the throne. The heavy, iron-enforced doors of the cafes were finally unlocked. A terrified, disoriented, and deeply traumatized Mustafa was pulled from the darkness of the cage and placed directly onto the magnificent golden throne of the Ottoman Empire. And right beside him, rising from the ashes of her 14-year exile, was Halime Sultan. She returned to Topkapi Palace not as a slave, not as a consort, but as the Valide Sultan, the supreme Queen Mother. She was now, officially and undisputedly, the single most powerful person on earth. But ruling a vast, highly militarized global empire with a king who was completely detached from reality proved to be an impossible nightmare. Sultan Mustafa's madness couldn't be hidden. He would run aimlessly through the palace gardens, screaming at unseen ghosts. During highly sensitive state meetings, he would randomly knock turbans off the heads of his terrified prime ministers. Most famously, he was seen standing at the edge of the sea, desperately tossing solid gold coins to the fish so they would have something to spend. The powerful military factions, deeply humiliated by the state of their emperor, quickly grew restless. Within a mere 96 days, they staged a palace coup. They dragged the weeping, confused Mustafa off the throne and locked him right back into the darkness of the cage. Halime was once again violently stripped of her power and thrown back into exile. In their place, the military crowned a bold, ambitious 14-year-old boy named Osman II. The empire thought they had finally restored order. But Halime Sultan had tasted the intoxicating poison of absolute power. She had ruled the world for 96 days, and as she sat in exile once more, she swore a terrifying oath. She was going to take her throne back, no matter how much blood had to be spilled to get it. Halime Sultan was back in the cold, unforgiving isolation of the old palace, but her eyes were fixed firmly on the golden throne she had just lost. The new emperor, Sultan Osman II, was only 14 years old, but he was incredibly ambitious, highly intelligent, and dangerously bold. He recognized the terrifying influence that the Queen Mothers and the military commanders held over the empire. He wanted to break their grip. In his relentless pursuit of absolute power, the young sultan made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. He decided to defund, disarm, and completely replace the Janissaries. The Janissaries were not just soldiers. They were the heavily armed, highly dangerous Praetorian Guard of the Ottoman Empire. They considered themselves the true owners of the state. When rumors of the Sultan's plan to replace them leaked out, a dark wave of fury swept through the military barracks. From her exile, Halime Sultan smelled blood in the water. She knew this was the exact moment to strike. Using the boundless, unimaginable wealth of her son-in-law, the ruthless commander Kara Davud Pasha, Halime began to actively fund a massive military rebellion. She sent carts full of gold into the Janissary barracks. She paid the soldiers to turn against their sovereign. She poured fuel onto the raging fire of military discontent, turning a political dispute into a full-blown apocalypse. In May of 1622, the magnificent city of Istanbul descended into absolute, terrifying chaos. Tens of thousands of heavily armed, furious janissaries poured into the streets, burning buildings and chanting for the Sultan's head. The impenetrable walls of Topkapi Palace, which had protected the Ottoman dynasty for centuries, were violently breached. The sacred, unspoken rule that the Sultan was untouchable was shattered in an instant. The rebel soldiers stormed the royal chambers and dragged the young, terrified Emperor Osman II out of his palace. What followed was a scene so deeply humiliating that it would scar the Ottoman Empire forever. They stripped the Emperor of the world of his majestic silk robes and forced him into filthy, torn rags. They threw him onto the back of a malnourished, broken-down cart horse. As the horse slowly marched through the crowded, chaotic streets of Istanbul, the public watched in stunned silence. The emperor was mocked, cursed, and physically assaulted by his own soldiers. The tragic procession finally ended at the infamous Yedikule dungeons, the fortress of 7 towers. It was a massive, terrifying stone prison located right on the ancient walls of the city. There, deep in the pitch-black, suffocating dungeons, the final act of Halime Sultan's revenge was executed. On the direct, explicit orders of Halime, Kara Davud Pasha and a group of ruthless henchmen entered the Sultan's cell. Young Osman fought desperately for his life, proving he had the blood of a warrior, but he was eventually overpowered. He was brutally strangled to death. To prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the deed was done and that the throne was empty once more, Kara Davud Pasha drew his dagger. He cut off the murdered emperor's ear, placed it on a silver platter, and personally delivered it to Halime Sultan in the old palace. It was a line that had never, ever been crossed. For the very first time in the 300-year history of the dynasty, an Ottoman emperor had been violently overthrown and murdered by his own subjects. The divine aura of the Sultan was broken forever. The empire would never be the same. And the architect of this historical trauma, the woman who had orchestrated the bloodiest coup in Ottoman history, was Halime Sultan. She had taken her revenge. She had taken back the world. But the poison of absolute power was about to destroy her entirely. The bloody coup was a total, terrifying success. Halime Sultan had pulled her mentally shattered son, Mustafa, out of the dark confines of the Kafesh and placed him directly back onto the golden throne of the Ottoman Empire. For the second time in her life, Halime was the Valide Sultan, the supreme Queen Mother. But this time, she was completely untouchable. The military was on her payroll, her ruthless son-in-law commanded the armies, and the emperor was entirely under her control. She had officially become the undisputed dictator of the world's most powerful empire. But history teaches us a very dark, unforgiving lesson. The blood of a murdered sovereign stains absolutely everything it touches. The brutal, highly publicized assassination of the young Sultan Osman didn't bring stability to the empire. It ignited a massive, apocalyptic firestorm. The news of the horrific regicide spread like wildfire across the vast Ottoman territories. From the dusty plains of Anatolia to the bustling markets of Egypt and Syria, the empire erupted into violent, uncontrollable rebellion. The provincial governors, the public, and even factions of the military were profoundly disgusted by the unprecedented murder of Genç Osman. The sacred aura of the Ottoman dynasty had been shattered, and the people demanded devastating revenge against the conspirators. Inside the walls of Topkapi Palace, paranoia began to utterly consume Halime Sultan. She realized that sitting on the throne was far more dangerous than fighting for it. She stopped sleeping. She saw traitors in every shadow and assassins behind every door. In her desperate attempt to maintain her iron grip on power, she initiated a horrific purge. She began executing anyone who posed even a slight threat to her authority, including some of her closest, most loyal allies. The palace corridors ran thick with the blood of statesmen and eunuchs. But the public outrage outside the palace walls could not be silenced with executions. The rebel armies were marching closer to the capital, and the angry mobs in Istanbul were demanding that the murderers of the young sultan be brought to immediate, brutal justice. Halime realized she needed a scapegoat, a sacrifice, and she didn't hesitate for a single second. She turned her cold, calculating eyes on the very man who had orchestrated the bloody coup for her own son-in-law, the ruthless Grand Vizier Kara Davud Pasha. When the pressure became absolutely unbearable, Halime threw him to the wolves. She officially stripped him of all his military titles, confiscated his immense wealth, and issued his death warrant. In a chilling twist of poetic justice, Kara Davud Pasha was dragged through the same chaotic streets of Istanbul and thrown into the exact same cell in the Yedikule dungeons where he had brutally murdered the young emperor. As the deaf and mute executioners wrapped the silken cord around his neck, he realized the terrifying truth about the woman he had served. Halime Sultan had absolutely no loyalty to anyone but herself and her son. She watched her own daughter become a grieving widow just to protect her crown. But sacrificing her son-in-law was not enough to put out the fire. The empire was rapidly collapsing under the weight of her tyranny. The imperial treasury, drained by endless bribes to the military and the lavish spending of the harem, was completely empty. The powerful janissaries, the same elite soldiers who had placed Halime in power, finally began to realize the horrifying truth. They were being manipulated by a mad, unstable emperor and a tyrannical, bloodthirsty queen mother. The military factions that once cheered for her began to quietly sharpen their swords. The golden cage she had built around herself was slowly turning into a death trap. The poison of absolute power had infected every vein of the empire, and the final, devastating reckoning was fast approaching. The golden age of Halime Sultan had finally come to an end. The poison of absolute power had destroyed everything she had fought so desperately to build. The same powerful military factions, the elite janissaries and sipahis who had placed her on the throne, were now marching directly on the gates of Topkapi Palace. The empire was on the brink of total collapse. The treasury was completely empty, and the people were starving in the streets. The military issued a final, terrifying ultimatum to the Queen Mother. Step down immediately, or the entire empire will burn. For the very first time in her life, Halime realized she was entirely alone. Her loyal spies had abandoned her. Her ruthless son-in-law was dead, and her son, the emperor, was completely lost in the dark depths of his own madness, unable to comprehend the chaos unfolding outside his window. The brilliant political mastermind had finally run out of moves. The chessboard was empty. Faced with the imminent destruction of her entire family, Halime agreed to a devastating, heartbreaking compromise. She would, personally, orchestrate the dethronement of her own son, pulling him off the throne for the second time, but on one absolute, non-negotiable condition. His life must be spared. The military leaders, desperate to restore order without shedding more royal blood, agreed to the terms. Sultan Mustafa was gently guided away from the golden throne and led back into the suffocating darkness of the kafes, the cage that had broken his mind in the first place. He would spend the rest of his life locked in that room, entirely forgotten by the world outside. As for Halime, for the third and final time in her tumultuous life, she was stripped of her majestic crown, her vast political power, and her royal titles. She was escorted out of Topkapi Palace and banished to the crumbling, isolated walls of the old palace. As the heavy, iron-studded wooden doors closed behind her, they didn't just close on her political career, they closed on an entire era of Ottoman history. In her final exile, there was no secret network of spies. There were no hidden carts of gold or whispered alliances in the dark. There was only absolute, crushing silence. She spent her final days in total isolation, sitting by a cold window, haunted by the terrifying ghosts of her past. She was tormented by the memory of a beloved strangled son, a young, brutally murdered emperor, and an executed son-in-law. The blood she had spilled to survive had ultimately drowned her. When Halime Sultan quietly passed away in the year 1623, there were no grand imperial ceremonies. There was no majestic funeral procession winding through the streets of Istanbul, and there were no state mourners weeping for the Queen Mother. The woman who had literally brought the Ottoman Empire to its knees faded away in the shadows, entirely alone. She was buried in a modest, quiet grave located inside the tomb of her beloved firstborn son, Prince Mahmud. In a tragic twist of poetic destiny, she was finally reunited in death with the brilliant, charismatic boy whose brutal murder had broken her heart and set the entire world on fire. She had started her life as a terrified, nameless slave girl in the freezing mountains of the Caucasus. She had risen to become the undisputed, absolute ruler of the greatest empire on earth. But in the end, she paid the ultimate, devastating price for her ambition. Halime Sultan didn't just survive history, she violently rewrote it. And the scars she left on the Ottoman Empire would remain visible for centuries to come. Halime Sultan's dark, blood-stained legacy remains one of the most fiercely debated topics in history. For centuries, historians have asked the same haunting question: who was she, really? Was she a power-hungry, manipulative tyrant who orchestrated the first regicide in Ottoman history? a woman who was so utterly blinded by ambition that she gladly sacrificed the lives of a young emperor, her own loyal allies, and even her son-in-law, just to keep her hands on the crown? Or was she a victim? A desperate, terrified mother who was violently thrown into a demonic game of political chess she never asked to play. A mother who watched 19 innocent boys being carried out in wooden coffins and realized that if she didn't become a monster, her own children would be next. In a brutal, unforgiving system built entirely on bloodshed and the survival of the fittest, she simply became the fittest of them all. But in the end, the system broke her anyway. The story of Halime Sultan is a terrifying reminder of the true cost of absolute power. When you play the Game of Thrones in the Ottoman Empire, you either win or you die. Halime managed to do both. If you enjoyed this deep, cinematic dive into the bloody and magnificent history of the Ottoman Empire, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments below. Do you think Halime Sultan was a cold-blooded villain or a tragic victim of her time? Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to Empire Whispers, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another dark, untold chapter of history. Until next time, keep listening to the whispers of the Empire.